What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I'm going to share the 3 rules of fall jig fishing. Let's get into it. Rule number 1 of fall jig fishing is find rock, find bass. In the fall, a lot of bass are going to be setting up around some type of rock, whether that's a rocky bluff wall, a flatter pea gravel bank, or chunk rock areas. Whenever I'm fishing a jig, I really like to focus on those bigger chunk rock areas, both up against the bank and offshore. A jig is a great tool for getting around in rocks, and I always prefer to throw a football jig in the fall, even when I'm fishing shallow. A football jig comes through cover extremely well, and my go-to is this Fish Throwing Offshore jig. It's a 5/8 ounce jig. I've made a video about my different trailers and stuff just a couple weeks ago, and I'll basically just change my trailer based on the water temperature and the depth I'm fishing to change the rate of fall of this jig. And because I can fish this jig in a lot of scenarios, I can pretty much put one bait in my hand and cover from, let's say, 2 foot of water all the way out to 30 feet of water, which a lot of times you have to do in the fall. When you are looking for these rocky areas, you want to try to find isolated patches of rock. A lot of times you'll have banks that have tons of chunk rock for miles and miles, and a lot of times those areas are difficult to dissect because there's so much rock in the area. Instead, I like to find small sections of chunk rock, both shallow and offshore. When you're fishing up shallow around the rock, the key is to try to find a transition area where you have more of the flatter slate rock or bluff rock that transitions into the smaller pea gravel rock, the little tiny pebbles. In those transition zones, if you can find a 20 to 30 yard stretch of chunk rock, you have a limited area that you need to target, which is perfect for a jig because you can't cover that much water with a jig in general. You can pitch it down there, let it sink, hop it a few times, and try to work as quick as you can. But a lot of times you'll fish over those fish, and other times you just won't cover enough water in a day to get enough bites. Now, if you were throwing a bait like a spinnerbait or a crankbait, you could cover that water. But usually conditions are going to dictate whether those baits are working or not, which we'll talk about in future rules here. And so when I am fishing a jig, I want to slow down in key stretches. And so if you can find, again, 20 to 30 yard stretches of those chunk rock areas, you're going to be able to limit the amount of water you have to cover, put your bait in a high productive zone, and work that bait from, let's say, right up against the bank to maybe 10 to 15 feet off the bank, and work a little more methodically to get those fish that maybe aren't as aggressive that would normally be to bite a spinnerbait or a crankbait. Now, you can also find these chunk rock areas offshore as well. A lot of times if you use side imaging or down imaging, you can identify rocks offshore. They're the size of maybe a baseball all the way up to a basketball size rock. That's kind of the rock size I'm looking for. And what I'm hoping to find is a grouping of rocks that is out alone by itself, either on an area of mud, sand, or pea gravel. These isolated rocky spots are ideal for fishing a jig because, again, you're not going to be able to cover that much water with this bait. So if you can find a rock pile that's the size of the table here in front of me, the front deck of your boat, maybe the size of like a picnic table, something like that, that's kind of the size you're looking for. You don't want to find a massive stretch of rock offshore that's maybe even 30 or 40 yards long like you have up shallow, because it's gonna take you a lot of time to work through that area, dragging your jig offshore. Whenever I am fishing offshore, the smaller the object I can focus on, the fewer casts it takes me to actually land my bait in that area, and I can work it more effectively. It also is great when that object or that rock pile is isolated, because all of those fish in that area will be attracted to that one isolated rock pile. It does take time to find these isolated rock piles, and sometimes it might take me 20 to 30 minutes of graphing before I find one that is, again, isolated by itself, the correct size with the right size rock. But when you find them in the fall, you're almost always going to catch a fish, so it makes the graphing time worth it. If you're fishing in a tournament, you can hopefully practice beforehand and find some of these isolated areas and then just milk run them throughout the day, dragging that jig slow and getting a lot of bites. Now, the rocks are really effective as well because they will attract the different forage that the bass are feeding on in the fall, which is usually some type of shad, some type of brim or perch, or crawfish. Crawfish is kind of the number one contender, especially as that water temperature drops below 65 degrees in the fall. Crawfish are going to be more active in that 50 to 65 degree water temperature range, and a lot of times you find them in that chunk rock. So throwing a jig in those areas is a perfect way to match the hatch and get a ton of bites. Now you can also fish through those areas with a crankbait or a spinnerbait and other things that imitate shad and perch and crawfish, but that really depends on the conditions. And that brings us to rule number 2. You want to throw a jig when you have inactive bass. What I mean by inactive bass is basically bass that don't really want to feed all that much. And usually that's down to the weather conditions. This is either going to be when you have bright bluebird skies, no wind, or post-front conditions. A jig excels in these tougher conditions when the bass don't want to roam and move around all that much. But in the fall, they actually have a tendency to do that because a lot of shad move shallow, there's a lot of baitfish activity around the banks, and most of the time, you're going to be able to get more bites in a day by throwing a reaction bait like a spinnerbait or a crankbait. So a jig, for me, is a very situational bait in the fall. I really only throw it, again, when you have those slick, calm conditions, you have no wind, or if you're in those post-frontal conditions where you kind of have those bluebird skies, no wind, no cloud days anyways, but those fish are also just not really that willing to chase a bait. Now you can catch fish on a jig in any condition, especially when you have wind and clouds and things like that. But the thing about those conditions is that the bass tend to roam more. And in the fall, like I mentioned, they are spread out even more than they are other times of the year. So by using a moving bait, like a spinnerbait or a crankbait, you can cover more water and usually catch more fish in the fall. That's one of the reasons why I feel like a jig is sometimes underutilized in the fall as well, though, because so many anglers are focused on throwing those moving baits. And if you can slow down just a little bit on those kind of tough fishing days, quote unquote, and target those smaller isolated stretches I talked about in rule number 1, you can a lot of times outfish a lot of other anglers. The trick with that is just basically figuring out what the conditions are presenting you on that day and choosing the right bait to match those conditions. In addition to those conditions being kind of tough a lot of times, the fish are going to be sitting really tight to cover because the sun is going to provide a lot of shade. And so a jig is a really good tool at getting into those hard to reach places around the thickest parts of a boat dock where there's the most shade, the heart of a brush pile, and around rock. We mentioned in rule number 1 that you want to fish around rock with a jig as much as possible. But if you don't have rock on your lake, you can catch fish still around a lot of those heavy cover areas that are going to produce a lot of shade on those sunny days. Again, brush piles, patches of offshore grass, boat docks, stumps, things like that are all great places to throw a jig, though they're not my number 1 choice. I will go with the rock above everything else if it's available on my lake, because I feel like I can get the most number of bites that way. But if you are, in an area of the lake or on a lake in general that doesn't have a lot of rock, then going to those other types of cover that produce shade and throwing that jig in those tough conditions will generate a lot of bites. I've had some really good days in the fall targeting isolated offshore brush piles with a football jig just like this. And a lot of guys don't throw a football jig in brush piles. I designed this Fish the Moment offshore jig to have this double cable guard weed guard, which comes through brush really well. And I'll fish this 5/8 ounce jig in brush piles that are in 3 foot of water out to 25 feet of water. And one of my kind of favorite fall jig patterns is actually to find brush piles that are a little bit out of the water after lakes are drawn down for the winter drawdown. On Lake Hamilton in Arkansas, I would always catch a ton of fish when they would do a 4 or like 6 foot drawdown, and you would barely see the tops of these crappie piles sticking out of the water. Now I would just run around with football jig, fishing all those brush piles that you could barely see just sticking out of the water, and you would catch a pile of fish and some really good fish doing it. Again, if you had more windy, cloudy conditions, a lot of times I would throw an Alabama rig or a spinnerbait or a crankbait around those same brush piles. But when it's got slick, calm, no wind, tougher conditions, that jig would always put them in the boat for me. So that's rule number 2. Rule number 3 of fall jig fishing is to fish fast, slow. What do I mean by that? Well, basically in the fall, as I mentioned, a lot of these fish are going to be more spread out. The bass don't all transition into the backs of creeks or bays at the exact same time in the fall. A lot of times they move in waves, and this is going to spread the fish out from the main lake all the way to the backs of the creeks. As a result, it's a lot less likely that you're going to pull up on one stretch of bank and catch like 10 fish on a jig. Instead, you might get 1 or 2 bites on a bank and then have to move on. In the spring, a lot of times you'll find an entire wave of bass will move up into a pocket and you can fish down one bank really thoroughly, maybe multiple times, and catch a limit or 2 limits of fish. But that doesn't happen as much for me in the fall. Instead, again, you're going to get 1 to 2 bites per bank. So to basically counteract this, you want to try to cover as much water as possible with your jig while still fishing slow enough that you're not going to work the bait right past the fish. The way I do this is by throwing a heavier jig, as I mentioned. This 5/8 ounce jig allows that bait to get down to the bottom quicker, so I'm not wasting a ton of time working that bait through the middle of the water column. It just gets straight down to the bottom, right in those rocks or that wood. And then I'm going to try to work that bait slowly when it's in the water. So I'll give it a few hops, move it kind of slow. I'm not going to basically be like reeling it right back to the boat. But then as soon as I get out of maybe the rocks or a few feet off the bank, I'm gonna reel that bait in, throw back into that area, and try to cover that area in maybe 10 to 15 casts. Again, going all the way back to rule number 1, you want to find areas that are not that large. Small transition zones that are 20, 30 yards long. Small rock piles the size of the front deck of your boat. A few isolated boat docks. 1 isolated brush pile. All these things are things you can fish in less than 10 casts, maybe 15 casts at most if you get a longer stretch of transition bank. You can then fish that little key stretch with your 10 casts and then quickly move to the next area. This is what I mean by fishing fast, slow. You're actually working your bait slow. So when it gets down into the water, into the strike zone, your bait is going to be sitting there for a while and enticing those fish. But as soon as that bait is out of that strike zone, reel it in, make another cast quick. Once you've covered the whole strike zone, run and find another one as fast as possible and try to cover as much water as possible in the fall. I find that the number one mistake I see anglers making in the fall is they're not covering enough water. And you'll have a tendency when you put a slow moving bait like a jig in your hand to fish slow. You're gonna want to cover every single inch of these banks. You're gonna want to fish the steep sections of the bank, the flatter sections, fish all the way back in the creek. And it can slow you down to the point where you may only fish 5 or 6 banks in a couple of hours. But what I find is if I can fish, let's say, 6 banks every hour, I am going to give myself a really good chance of catching a good number of fish. That means I'm spending 10 minutes per bank, and that's including time to run around. Sometimes I might fish a stretch for 6 or 7 minutes, run 3 minutes to the next stretch, fish it for 6 or 7 minutes, and in that time I'm making, again, maybe 10 casts, so each cast is taking me about half a minute. I'm not working super long through my casts. Though when my bait gets down there, I'll leave it down there for 10, 15 seconds, reel it in, next cast, reel it in, next cast. And by covering that much water, you're going to account for the fact those fish are so spread out throughout these creeks or throughout these bays or whatever you're fishing, and you're going to be able to put a lot more fish in the boat and make fall fishing not as challenging as it normally is. Now, the one caveat to this is when you are fishing offshore, if you're going to be fishing isolated brush piles and rock piles and things like that, you're going to have a lot of those areas found. And a lot of times when you go to the lake, you may not have those found. So one thing you can do, which is what I do, is either spend the first couple of hours of your day graphing with side imaging and down imaging to find brush piles and rock piles, or mark those objects on Google Earth. I have a bunch of videos on this channel already showing how I use Google Earth to mark offshore areas. It's basically my areas videos I post on Friday. And I'm trying to keep my videos in some sort of theme throughout the week. This video got a little bit delayed, so it's on a Wednesday, my 3 rules video. But usually they'll show up on Mondays, the 3 rules videos. Then my video in the middle of the week, I'm still trying to figure out what to do with that one on Wednesdays. And my Friday videos are the area videos. So if you want to get a better idea of where to fish the jigs or any of the baits I'm talking about and how to implement these rules on the water and location-wise, check out my Friday videos. Moreover, if you want to get any of these episodes on your phone so you can listen to them as a podcast, you can go to the Apple Podcasts or the Spotify app, download the Fish the Moment podcast, and listen to the audio from this video and all the Bass Fishing Declassified videos on the Fish the Moment podcast. We also post other content for Fish the Moment and past videos, any live streams I do. All that stuff is on the Fish the Moment podcast that you can download and listen to as you drive to the lake. Definitely check out that video and let me know if you like this video down in the comments below. These were the 3 rules of fall jig fishing. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you on the next one.